Good morning from Washington, D.C., and good afternoon to those in Europe. I'm James Politi, the Washington Bureau Chief for the Financial Times, and I'm delighted to be with you today. So thanks very much to the German Marshall Fund for asking me to moderate and to talk about the U.S. economy, the transatlantic economy, the recovery from the pandemic. At the FT, we're very focused on all the twists and turns of the transatlantic relationship. And personally, as a dual US-Italian national, I'm also kind of deeply sort of interested in understanding it better. And it's fair to say we're especially fortunate to be joined today by Cecilia Rouse, the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors under President Biden. Cecilia was chosen to serve in the Biden administration after serving as Dean of Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs, where she had been an academic for a very long time. She is one of America's most renowned economists, a specialist in the economics of education and labor market. She previously worked in both Barack Obama and Bill Clinton's economic teams and was confirmed by the Senate to her current position by an overwhelming and really bipartisan vote of 95-4 in March. So let me kick it off with a question about the US economic outlook. It's clear that the economy is rebounding quickly, but that liftoff has been kind of fairly turbulent, despite the massive stimulus that's been plowed into the economy. So what can we expect over the summer months? Will things sort of smooth out?
Well, thank you for that question. So the U.S. economy is benefiting from the massive amounts of stimulus that we have put forth, and the Biden administration is particularly proud of the American Rescue Plan, which not only funded what I'm going to call very effective vaccination rollout in the U.S., which is what underlies that dramatic takeoff, and also providing support to families and businesses, state and local governments. So that, hang on a second, my computer says it's about to restart. That would not be good. The support to families, businesses, state and local governments, which has provided the funding to keep our economy churning in these months. So yes, we've had a pretty dramatic takeoff. The way I think about it is we've got nearly a $23 trillion economy. You don't go from nearly a standstill to running that marathon overnight. And we know that there are supply chain disruptions. Many businesses, sectors, shut down last spring. Automakers canceled chip orders, not knowing what the demand for autos would look like over the coming months. There's a long lead time in getting chips, semiconductor chips. So that's caused a disruption. Many other businesses liquidated their inventories, often at a loss. And now they're trying to all rebuild very suddenly. So we expect there to be some turbulence. This analogy of the aircraft taking off, I think I've hit my limit here. But we expect some turbulence. I try not to do a lot of certain forecasting. I think we're in a time where these times are unprecedented. We haven't seen economies go from largely a standstill to trying to go back very quickly because we haven't really seen economies that have been brought to heel because of a virus, which is not an economic problem. So once the virus is dealt with, the economics in the US were really pretty solid. So, I don't want to get into serious forecasting, but I'm very optimistic that these supply chain disruptions, that the labor market will be healing in the months to come. In the US, the fall is very momentous because schools being closed, which we had more of than across the Atlantic. We followed more school closures, which really affected parents and caretakers profoundly. We're strongly expecting that they'll be reopening in the fall, which will allow people to get back to work and know that their kids have someplace to be full time. So I expect that over the coming months, we will get back to a full recovery, but we are, as of our last employment report, 7.6 million jobs fewer than we were last time this year when the pandemic started. So we have a long way to go.
And are you more or less convinced today, compared to a few weeks ago, that the inflation spike we saw this spring will still be sort of a transitory phenomenon? And this also has, big implications, not just for the U.S., but also for the global economy, if sort of inflation were to get out of control in America.
Yeah, I mean, look, the American Rescue Plan was an important investment, and I know that has sparked some concerns that it was too big of an investment given the crisis. And that is obviously a concern, but I have to say that when I look at the data, I don't yet see evidence that these price pressures are anything but transitory. Obviously, we have to be watching. We have to be watching. We know that the Federal Reserve, which is really in charge of monetary policy, they're an independent agency, is watching even more closely. We'll learn more about what they're thinking this afternoon. But I don't see evidence in the data that our inflation expectations are becoming unanchored, which is what would be the problem for it to spiral out of control. And yet when we look at where the price pressures are, they're in autos or in transportation. We see some in residential construction, housing, and in our producer price index yesterday, we saw a big spike in grain, which we actually believe is due to the way the farmers purchase grains and due to demand in other parts of the world. So I again don't see evidence that it's anything but transitory, but this is again unprecedented. But this is what I think we needed to do this. Let's put it that way.
The Biden administration has, in a certain sense, kind of exported its message that the risks of going too big on fiscal policy were smaller than the risks of an insufficient response. And we saw it in the G7 communique and in the way that G7 leaders talked about this over the weekend. What is your, is there a concern in Washington that, for instance, European governments might start withdrawing support too early, and that could have ramifications for the rest of the transatlantic economic relationship, and could cut short their own recovery?
Well, far be it from me to be making and advising other countries. I've got a full-time job working on advising this president on the U.S. What I would say is we're not done yet. This pandemic is, we are starting to believe it's under control in the U.S., but we actually are not done yet either. We've got, I think it's 67% of adults have had at least one shot, maybe that's 2 shots in the arm. We're seeing slowing rates of people getting vaccinated. We are pushing and we are trying to help people understand how important that is, but we know that cases are rising in parts of our country. We also know that the virus is, out of control in other parts of the world. And we will not all recover fully, including here in the US, until the whole world is recovered. So I think it's important that we all understand that our economies are at the mercy of this virus, that we need to be providing the support to ensure that the world gets vaccinated over the coming months and years, just as quickly as possible. And that until we can get our economies back really to full health. These analogies, I need to stop. Until we can get our economies, really back to where they were before the virus hit, we need to be supporting our workers and our businesses. Obviously, that support needs to be moderated and needs to be receptive to the economic conditions. But I guess I would just highlight that we are not through this until the whole world is through this.
So we've just witnessed in the last few weeks 2 big kind of examples of transatlantic cooperation on economic policy. We had a G7 agreement on global corporate taxation. We had the pact yesterday to resolve the big dispute over aircraft subsidies between Boeing and Airbus. Does this suggest to you that the sort of tide is changing after the tensions of the Trump era? Is this kind of a new dawn in terms of cooperation on the economic front between the US and the EU?
It's not just a suggestion. This administration understands that we need to work with our partners. We need to, we exist in a global economy. We have to be working with our partners, our trading partners, but also there are really important issues that are going to require all of us to work together. So the pandemic is one of them. Climate change is another. We have to work together. That is not the particles don't stop at the US border. We have, climate change doesn't stop at the US border. We have to work together to address climate change. So we have common problems and we need to work on them together. The president has also reasserted his commitment to NATO. So this is a president who wants to work with our allies, wants to work across the world in order to obviously his primary concern is the US, but he understands that the US thrives within context, and that is an international context. So it's not just a suggestion, it's quite intentional.
It seems to me that a lot of the sort of big structural changes here in the US are kind of predicated on a very difficult path for congressional approval. We have, the $4 trillion in spending, in additional spending over a decade in areas like infrastructure, childcare, climate change. A global corporate tax deal would also have to be approved ultimately by Congress. I mean, how can you sort of guarantee that the agenda will actually kind of come to fruition? It seems like it's quite a difficult path at the moment. Things feel a little stuck.
Well, one thing I've learned in my third tour now is I can't guarantee anything, but I can tell you this, that this president is really committed to this agenda. The United States has had decades of not investing in its infrastructure. We've not been investing in our own R&D. We've got really important research needs if we're going to be addressing these important issues such as climate change. This is a president that understands and values the role of the public sector in working together with the private sector. So this is not about a public sector takeover, but firmly believes that if we're really going to continue leading the world, we need to be filling in to those places where the private sector is not helping the US to really flourish. So he is committed to this agenda. He understands, furthermore, that these investments that the federal government needs to make need to be paid for, and they should be paid for by those who've really been benefiting from our new economic order, and over time in the US have not really been contributing their fair share to our tax revenues. So he's committed to that agenda. What he has said is just inaction is the only option that is off the table. So he's committed to doing something big, but he's in deep conversations with Congress. The way the US system works is we have to work with Congress in order to get things passed. But he is motivated to make this happen because he firmly believes it's important for all Americans, especially those who've been somewhat left behind over the last several decades, at least in the United States. He also believes that this goes to our democracy, and that if we are going to succeed as a democratic, democratic country, we need to ensure that everybody is benefiting from economic growth, and that's really at the core of his policies.
And just on the kind of tax increases that are used to pay for these plans, both on the corporate side and the individual side, there has been, I would say, kind of a predictable wall of resistance from Republicans and some jitters among some Democrats as well, even though these measures kind of poll relatively well. The negotiations are continuing, but what's your message to kind of fellow Democrats on why they should sort of more maybe wholeheartedly embrace these tax increases? And also, I mean, if there's no agreement on how to pay for them, would it be acceptable, especially with Treasury yields kind of where they are at the moment and having not really moved higher in the last few months? Could something be approved with more deficit spending, just given the importance of these structural changes?
Well, what I would say is that the investments that are contemplated and proposed in the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan are really important and will help to bolster our economic growth and to ensure that it's more widely shared. But governments, we have to have the revenue to pay for them, whether it's today, tomorrow, they do need to be paid for. And in the United States, we know that the federal revenue has been declining, especially among the wealthiest earners and among corporations. So what the proposals that the president has put forward make a lot of economic sense. You know, some of it is about the 2017 tax cut that was done under the previous administration, which has not generated the kind of economic growth that was promised or at least predicted at the time. And which, when you look at a chart of who has really benefited from those tax cuts, it has gone to the very wealthiest and not been evenly shared, you know, among all Americans. So the revenue raisers that the president has proposed really do level the playing field and make the tax code fair. But he's open to other ideas that people have and that Congress may have for how to generate more revenue so that the federal government can make these important investments. So that's what I would say to the Democrats and Republicans, which is that we all drive on the same roads. We all, you know, fly into the same airports, which have, you know, desperately needing of, you know, investments in the United States. We know that climate change is coming. These are really important investments we need to be making, and we need to have the revenue to do so. This is an unusual time. We expect that the federal government can't afford to be borrowing more because interest rates have been so low over the coming decades. But fundamentally, you know, we should be raising more revenue so we can make these important investments. So, you know, I think the president's open to other ideas as well.
I wanted to ask you about wages. So we are seeing an increase in wages. We're starting to see a significant increase in wages. We have anecdotal evidence of wages going up as well, and greater incentives to draw people back into the workforce. Is this kind of, from your perspective, is this to be welcomed as kind of the realization of a longstanding kind of macroeconomic goal, or is it something to be kind of feared in a certain sense, or something to be concerned about if it were to kind of potentially fuel more sustained inflation? How are you looking at the wage dynamic at the moment?
At the moment, I am looking at the wage dynamic as evidence that markets work. What we've seen in the United States is the labor demand for labor has come back much more quickly than the supply. That's for a host of reasons, not the least of which is the fact that the virus is coming under control, and it's come under control very rapidly in the US. I mean, you were here, as you know, like it was overnight that the CDC said if you're fully vaccinated, you can take off your mask. That was only a few weeks ago, and it feels like it was a lifetime ago. And we know that many people, though, are still very concerned. I speak to people every day who are still very concerned and are wary after a year of being told this virus is really quite lethal. It's hard for many people to just turn around and say, okay, I can go back to being normal and interacting in a normal way. We also know that while the childcare issues and care issues are an issue for many people, and the pandemic, because many people have been at home, whether that without a job or with home telecommuting, I believe many people have the time to actually search for a better job match, which I think is a good thing. The reason we have unemployment insurance is so that when people lose a job through no fault of their own, they have some time to not just take the first job that comes along, but the first suitable job that comes along. And we know that better job matches result in higher productivity. The workers stay longer, their morale is higher, and that's good for the economy. So I personally am seeing the wage increases that we've seen so far as being evidence that the market is working. That said, in the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, part of what is predicated there is that we want to see the kinds of investments that will lead to good paying jobs for those who've been at the bottom of our wage distribution, for whom we have seen stagnated wages over the last several decades. they really have not benefited from the economic growth that we have seen in the US. I mean, even the growth, we would like it to be a little bit higher than it's been. So wage growth in and of itself is not a bad thing. We've seen stagnating wages at the bottom in the US while highest earners have been really benefiting. Obviously, we don't want to be sparking out of control wage, inflation that's caused by a push from wages. But I do know that in the United States, a healthy economy has wage growth that is across the income distribution, the wage distribution, and that's not what we've had over several decades.
I mean, you mentioned unemployment insurance. We're kind of in the middle. The extended unemployment insurance provisions are due to expire in September, but we're in the middle of a kind of real life experiment in Republican-led states where the local governments there are kind of ending the unemployment benefits early, actually this month in many cases. It's more than 20 states. Are you seeing any sort of data, any high frequency numbers? Do you have any sense of whether that's, there's been an impact from this? Because it obviously has implications for the rest of the recovery.
It does. The first of those decisions, so the first date at which people stopped receiving some of the extended unemployment insurance benefits was just June 12th. So that was, 4 days ago. So have not seen it yet. Tomorrow we will have initial claims in unemployment insurance, but even that will be too soon for us to see an impact of those decisions. But we will be interested to see what happens. We have these extended UI benefits for a reason. Again, we're not fully through this pandemic. Employers have increased their demand for workers, but they're not ready to absorb 7.6 million workers overnight. And so we know that many workers are still going to need some support. So we're watching, but it's too early to judge because really the first of the roll-offs were just 4 days ago.
So one of the big kind of mantras of Joe Biden was to sort of build back better, to avoid the pitfalls of policymaking in the aftermath of the financial crisis, which led to kind of a more sluggish recovery, the stagnant wages that you described before, and little progress in kind of curbing income and racial inequities, which have been entrenched kind of for so long. I mean, how confident are you that we can kind of get there? That, at the end of 4 years that you can say, well, actually, we've sort of created different kind of economy than the one that the US experienced before the pandemic?
Well, I believe in the policies that President Biden has put forth as being able to help us get there. We can already see, for example, if we take in the American Rescue Plan, one of the important provisions was an extension and expansion and making it refundable of the child tax credit, which goes to our lowest earning families and actually even further up the income distribution, but is a really important policy to address child poverty. And so the American Rescue Plan makes those payments, as I mentioned there, it's an expansion and makes them refundable. And importantly, Treasury has just announced and just will be making its first payments that'll be going monthly so that families will get those payments more regularly and not having to wait until April or the spring of every year when the tax season comes around. So if, those are the kinds of investments that are embedded in the American Families Plan, the American Jobs Plan. So if we're able to get the important pieces of this legislation, they really are designed to bring along all Americans and ensure that, for example, the jobs that are contemplated in the American Jobs Plan, whether in terms of creating more electric vehicle charging stations, addressing climate change, creating a greener economy. The researchers at Georgetown University have estimated that the types of occupations that are associated with the American Jobs Plan would largely go to people who do not have a bachelor's degree, so don't have a 4-year college degree. So these plans are designed to help bring people along, but obviously we need to see them actually get enacted.
And just looking, we have this kind of big burst of activity this year, sustained by fiscal stimulus. That stimulus will start to fade next year. Is there a little bit of concern about what it will look like when the stimulus starts to fade and the fiscal tailwinds turn into fiscal headwinds right as the midterm election campaigns are kind of underway?
The American Rescue Plan was designed to get us to the other side of this pandemic. When the pandemic struck, on average, the U.S. economy was doing pretty well. The American Jobs Plan, the American Families Plan are meant to start from a place where we're past the pandemic and to contemplate the kinds of longer term investments that we believe are very important to achieve these goals of Build Back Better, to really be investing in the U.S. economy, whether it's infrastructure, research and development, education, preschool, paid leave, childcare. Those are the kinds of investments that help families go to work if they choose to go to work, help workers balance care and work responsibilities, help ensure that young people get the kind of education that they need at an affordable price, provide the kinds of job opportunities. So those are the investments. They're designed to spend out over 8 to 10 years. So they're not meant to be that kind of stimulus, because we're not talking about stimulus. We're talking about investments to help really build economic growth that's more widely shared. So yes, the stimulus of the impulse from the American Rescue Plan will be coming off, but we should be back as an economy. We should be relatively healthy on average. And by our design, that's when these more important longer-term investments will start to be made as well.
And one of the kind of undercurrents of the kind of Bidenomics strategy seems to be to put the U.S. in a better competitive position around the world compared to especially kind of China and other autocracies. And we hear that quite a lot in sort of President Biden's remarks. I mean, how often do you hear that privately too? Can you tell us a little bit about, how President Biden speaks about his economic strategy and in the context of just America's place in the world?
Yeah, so that I believe is really what motivates his president. He believes in the American people. He believes in the American worker, and he's squarely in the camp of the middle-class American worker. So he wants those workers and families who have been left behind to be benefiting from being in the U.S. He believes in the days when the United States, we still are a leader in the world. He wants us to stay that way because that's the U.S. that he believes in, that he loves, and that he wants to see continue, and that he wants to lead. So yes, he's motivated by the American worker, by the middle class, but he also is motivated by wanting us to retain our position within the world. He also believes very strongly in democracy, has been very concerned about what we've seen in this country, which as you know full well, where I think he believes there's an existential threat to democracy, that if we don't learn to share the economic prosperity more broadly, so that all people are benefiting from the fruits of the American economy, that will be a real, our democracy is in danger, will be in danger.
Great. Well, thank you very much to Cecilia Rouse for being with us today. Thanks to the German Marshall Fund for organizing, and we're looking forward to the next session and the Fed meeting this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Take care.